Ready to stop spinning your wheels and start moving your business forward? You're in the right place. On each episode of Accelerate to Achieve, we'll discuss a crucial step in the journey, offering tips and advice that you can apply immediately within your own company. From financial management to customer success to digital transformation, we'll cover it all while providing leadership lessons from top industry insiders. In just 15 minutes, you'll be inspired to build momentum through action and achieve incredible results. Welcome to Accelerate to Achieve, the podcast that moves you from question to answer and idea to execution. Hello, and welcome back to the latest edition of the Accelerate to Achieve podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Walter, the founder of Parrels Advisory. Solving the really challenging things we face in life and at work is hard. There's rarely a playbook and often a lot of uncertainty staring us in the face. Add in the need to get people on board with the change and the complexity is only ramped up. If we fail to ask the right questions, we may never leave the starting line. Our guest today helps organizations with this every day. Now, I'm so happy we're joined today by Kelly Stewart, and she brings a natural desire and proven ability to bring out the best in an organization. Designing and facilitating strategic planning meetings to help clients envision their way forward, Kelly places an emphasis on engaging their stakeholders and demonstrating how they're making a positive impact on the world. Kelly, thank you so much for joining us today.
Ryan, thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be on the show. I respect your work, and I'm so happy to be having this conversation with you today.
Well, we're already off to a great start, so I can't wait for the rest of this. And I'll try not to throw my shoulder out, patting myself on the back. So to begin, what is it about how we frame a question that can really impact the outcome?
Excellent question. And fundamentally, it's the difference between whether we are going to close someone up or open them up. And by that, I mean other people that we're engaged in conversation with, but also ourselves, if we have an internal dialogue. So the way we frame the question, then, if we want to open people up so that we can find out what they're thinking, get some new ideas, understand what motivates them, and how that can apply to what we want to accomplish, then we need to ask questions that generate those ideas, that generate that energy. And oddly enough, coincidentally enough, they are called generative questions.
In speaking of questions that either close us or open us up, are there examples you can point to around how you might ask something differently to get one of those different responses?
Sure. A key to these generative questions, a couple key characteristics, right? They change the way a person thinks the moment the question is asked. So an example of that is if there's something that you're working on a project with someone and you really like what they've put together, some type of deliverable or process, right? I love what you did here. How might you roll it out to others? That immediately requires them to stop in the moment and think about, geez, I hadn't thought about that, right? So you're starting to change the way they think about this thing that they've created. The other thing that generative questions do is that they inspire images in the mind, right? That really compel people to act on something, gets them excited about it. And so that we see when questions, and I think a lot of organizations, would desire this, is what can we do to make every customer a raving fan? And see, that's a very different question because, again, the person who's being asked that question, they have to sit and think, and there's some type of image, right, that will come to mind because the brain will think more quickly in the images of, they will automatically hit what I call the jukebox of memories and recall a time when a customer was a raving fan, and then they can recall what made that happen. Very different from saying, what are you going to do to make our clients more loyal? Right? that inspires a whole other kind of image that we really don't want to pursue. And another key characteristic about generative questions, and this is the one that I find is, how should I say, most challenging, right? Most counterintuitive to what most people in business, especially leaders, whether you're a leader of yourself as a parent, but certainly in the workplace, Generative questions are ones for which we don't already have the answer. And we like to think that we have answers. Sometimes we think we're supposed to have the answers because we are, quote unquote, if you can see my bunny air quotes, the leader, right? But when we ask a question that we don't already have an answer to, such as, how can we support one another in taking these next steps? Then now we're starting to expose the full spectrum of possibilities, because we might be in the ballpark as a leader, we might have some general ideas, but the specificity is missing. And sometimes it's that specific nuance that makes the difference between what I call mid-range solution and a really high-range solution to what you're trying to accomplish.
You mentioned from the generative perspective how we can tell in the way we ask the question or we frame the question. Is there anything that could give us a clue in the response to the question that helps us understand if we're asking the right question or we asked it the right way?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And this is repeated in my own experience, clearly from others who I know who do this type of work, right? They have the same types of responses, but it's repeated all the time for me. Two things will happen. The first thing, the first few times you do this, let's say you've got a team and you're going to start asking more generative questions. As this first happens, you are going to hear, no one's ever asked me that before. So that right there is an indication that some change is taking place in the mind, right? Because we're used to we as team members, just as leaders think they should have all the answers, team members think they're going to anticipate the question or know what's coming, right? So that indicates right away something is changing in this person's mindset, right? They're pausing for that moment to consider what you've said. The second thing, and I alluded to it a second ago, is that the responses you get will be far more nuanced than anything that you think you might have been able to predict the response would be. And from that, when you do this as a repeated practice and you're having these conversations with multiple people, especially when you're focused on something that you want to accomplish, like the plan almost starts to write itself, which is not to say that you shouldn't take other counsel and think of some best practices, but you're going to get that other layer of what works for your team in your company in the markets that you serve based on their responses. And I have a little example of that. And it's a question I've asked before, whether it's a strategic planning implementation meeting or just, an idea generation meeting, is tell me about a time when you've had a good experience learning something new. What made it successful? And again, I cannot script what these responses would be, but when you start to pull them all together, you start to understand different things work for different people. And so you'll hear, I had a mentor. I was highly motivated. I pushed through. I had some times when I really thought, I'm not going to learn this, but I pushed through. I watched videos, right? I had reverse mentorship. I had someone younger than me teach me how to do this, or this was something I learned and I realized I need to practice it. And so when you start to put all of those things together, if what your plan involves is something new, then you start to have an understanding of how you can best support people going forward. And in the time that we live in, there is so much technology and other aids to deliver a little bit more of a personalized experience for your team, that's possible. Back when everything was offline, it would have been much harder to do that, right? Which is why so much of our business and industry relied on rote, repetitive tasks. But when we're looking for creativity and something new, we can support team members differently. But first, we have to understand what's the best way to support them. And the best people to ask are the people themselves.
You mentioned earlier generative questions, you don't know the answer and you don't know necessarily what they're going to say.
Mm-hmm.
But as humans, we have a typical desire, or many of us do, to want to find a solution right away to a problem.
Right.
How does that sabotage our efforts then?
Well, it's really the rush, right? It's the rush. As soon as you identify a problem or something like that, you want to identify the solution, because we're humans, right? We're action oriented. So that's one part of it. And in full disclosure, I am not a psychologist, I am not a neurologist, but there are things that we've learned and come to understand about the way our emotional response and our neurological responses to things. So our default response is often reactionary, going back generations. This is our fight or flight response. I will also add to that, because we see this more in business, our freeze and appease, right? People who will just be like, I'm not going to do it. I heard what you want me to do, but I'm not going to do it. And the appease, I don't get what you're doing and I'll just do it half-heartedly because I'm not really bought into it. But to your question, when we rush to the solving the problem, we're still thinking about the problem. And so what will happen then is we become very reactionary. How are we going to minimize this threat? We're looking for this quick fix. So lots of times we end up with reductive strategies, or what I call those like mid-level solutions, right? We start to just cut things right away. And what can we get rid of? Because we're looking to minimize a threat, which is vastly different from saying, let's take a moment and reflect on this, try to shake off the word problem from our vocabulary and reframe that to, how can we look at this as an opportunity? Is there an opportunity in here? And once we start to do that, we start to move up to that prefrontal cortex area where we have access to all of those things that make us wonderfully human.
I want to touch on something you mentioned in regards to the rush to answer the question or to resolve the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Is it possible through that we're actually asking the wrong question?
Sometimes, yes. Yes. And thank you for bringing that up, because I am a big advocate of the both and solution or scenario, not the either or. Lots of things coexist. And to have any type of a productive conversation, or if it's a strategic plan to achieve the outcomes that you want, it really does hinge on first having identified the right problem. So it is really important to do however that investigation is done. And I'm sure you're familiar with a lot of these things, right? I think it's the 5, sometimes 7 whys, fishbone analysis, right? Something that gets you to the root cause. For a lot of business leaders, it's their intuition, right? Because they've seen this play before, and they have a sense of what the problem is. So to know that is a good thing. What I suggest and recommend is that is not necessarily the time to move to possibility seeking. And if the constraints are such that you have to, something has to be done in the moment, then there's 3 things you can do. Just pause, breathe, nice deep breath in, deep breath out, and then start to get curious. Ask yourself these generative questions, because it starts with the internal dialogue. What might be going on here, right? What's really at the center of the table? What might be possible if we turn that upside down, right? What if we just flipped it and said, you know what? Instead of feeling like, and this is a common thing that I hear from business owners, it's getting harder and harder to differentiate. Okay, well, you can craft a solution. If you're going to solve that problem, you're going to talk about differentiating. And that means you're going to compare yourself to others, right? And adjust what you can based on what others are already doing. And that's okay. Possibility seeking says, we don't want to just differentiate. We want to stand out. And we want to stand out for the unique and inspiring things that we do. And more importantly, as we move into this more technology-driven world, we want our brand not only to stand out and also stand up to scrutiny, which means whatever we do next, right, we're going to be really transparent about it, because that's where it's all going. So that now, it excites the brain. How can we do that, right? And you can't get there if you rush to problem solving. But if you can pause, okay, breathe, and say, what can we do? What might be possible? You're on track then for finding those opportunities.
This is really, I think, deep stuff for a lot of us, and a concept perhaps that's tucked away in our mind and often unseen. So I'd like to thank you for helping unpack it, because for many of us, we probably don't take the time to think about it in enough detail. Mm-hmm. So with that all in mind, mm-hmm. what should someone who really wants to start unpacking all of this do to get down the right path, but not overwhelm themselves?
Right. That's a great question. And you do speak to something that we need to talk about first, which is this has been generations, right, of being rewarded for our critical thinking, right? And again, it has its time and place, both and. So critical thinking has its time and place. I think, though, with a heightened awareness of how fear shows up in our conversations, will help us to better kind of gauge ourselves. Like, am I even in the right frame of mind to start applying this? So things like anger, doubt, shock, disgust, because we see that, stress, these things show up in our conversations with ourselves or with others. And so just to kind of take a temperature test of where am I is the first step then to deciding to say, I'm going to choose a more positive emotion, right? I'm going to find something, and I'll talk about how we can do this to get to at least where I'm interested in what's going on. For some people, they're not, right? So how can I generate interest in what's going on? Optimism, curiosity, creativity, trust, hope, inspiration, confidence, right? All of those things that we really want and we know will be successful in helping us move forward. So the best way to do that is to really understand where you are and then say, this is the challenge, just as I've said, whatever that is, the problem, the challenge, the thing that we don't want. And we're going to flip it to something called the positive opposite. And if your listeners are in a place where they can write that down, I hardly encourage them to just write down what's the positive opposite of what this is. Because when we feel threatened in some way or down about something, it's very hard to see that. And again, that's now a biological response to the fight or flight mechanism. So when you do that, when you flip it, and that's what you're doing, you're saying, what's the positive opposite? Then you need to frame that scenario. So how good could this positive opposite get? And that shows up in questions like, we're finding it harder to keep up with market transformation, right? And really, who wouldn't? I mean, people are buying cars not only online, but from vending machines in some cases. Insurance companies are becoming wellness companies. We have no idea still, or we're starting to figure out how cryptocurrency and blockchain will affect us. There's a lot of change in our very distributed and dynamic business environments. So we could look for that solution with, we can't keep up with market transformation, and that's where we could start our plan. Or we can flip it and say, we rapid prototype to learn forward. That's a big statement. And some people are like, well, like, what does that even mean, right? Well, it's flipping, it's saying rapid prototyping. That means we're going to experiment. And we're not going to fail fast because, again, the brain says fail. It's a trigger word, but it's going to say we're going to learn things, and those things are going to help move us forward. So we start with that frame, and now we just keep asking, how good can that get? And that's when you'll see people start to come up with ideas like, well, we've been using this one software for 15 years, but we haven't really updated it. Maybe that's something that would help. Oh, well, we tried something 6 months ago that we started, but we didn't get a lot of traction. We'd like to revisit it because that might be something that helps us. Or we read something in some material. We're part of a panel where we heard this great idea. Maybe we should reach out to that person. Now, when that kind of binary response of this will work or it won't work, when that's removed, people have more latitude to be creative with their thoughts. And that's not to say that every idea gets implemented, but if you don't kind of reach for the stars, right, you're not going to get a solution that you're really happy with. So that's all part of it, is really just being aware of where you are, taking that negative and flipping it, and then framing it with those generative questions, right? When were we at our best? When did we transform something? We've been in business for a while. When did we transform something the last time? What made that successful, right? How do we use our strengths to get results in the marketplace? What are our clients facing that they need help with that we haven't really even thought about because we're so consumed with what's on our plate? But if we're in an industry that's changing for our clients as some type of a vertical, what do we know about that vertical? And are there ways that we can help with what they're facing? and make sense of what they're facing. So all of this really is about kind of breaking through what we've been conditioned to do for good reason and say, yes, that's appropriate. And there are times when we need to shift the tone and the direction of our conversations so that we can identify a full spectrum of possibilities. And in that, when you have those conversations with many people, not just kind of closed up in a conference room, but when the people who are going to be impacted by those changes, they commit to what they help create, right? And there's research that shows, I think it's high performing teams have 6 positive interactions to every 1 negative. And so I think that's really important to share with your listeners too, to be aware of that. And these emotions that I was talking about, I'm sorry, this is a much longer answer than you probably planned on, but the emotions that I was talking about is something called the wheel of emotions, and psychologists use that. And there are some variances in that depending on who the psychologist is working with. Sometimes it's children, right? Sometimes it's very specific, maybe people who have post-traumatic stress. But if you envision that wheel of emotions as a pizza, in the center are some kind of core emotions: sad, angry, and then it'll splinter out and it'll give you 2 more descriptive words for that emotion. And then that splinters out and gives you like 6 more descriptive words. And that's the wheel. When you look at that wheel, something that surprised me, depending on the size of your appetite, if you think of it like a pizza, 1 generous slice or 1.5 slices of that wheel are positive emotions. That's it, right? They all track back to happy, and that's it. So when we can grab on to those kind of good feeling emotions, we'll get better feeling thoughts. We'll get more creative thoughts. We'll get more motivated thoughts. And that's why it's so important to focus on it. And this idea of flipping it and framing it, it helps you get to that nice 1.5 slices of pizza that's really going to help you move forward.
Kelly, firstly, thank you for joining us today, and really for shining a light on something important that I think for many of us is probably hidden in the recesses of our mind.
Absolutely.
And until recently, we didn't have much visibility on. So thank you very much for bringing that to us and making it easier to understand, and doing so in a short period of time, because I am certain it could be something you would discuss much longer if given the opportunity. So thank you again.
Absolutely. I am thrilled. I deeply appreciate the opportunity to come and talk about that with you today and with your listeners. And thank you very much for the opportunity.
How we approach asking questions can significantly influence the types of answers we get. If we lose our sense of curiosity and willingness to explore, we paint ourselves into a very limited corner. It may be difficult to accept we won't have all the answers at the onset, but when in the course of history has that ever been the case for anything we've done of significance? Thank you for listening today. I look forward to joining you on the next episode. Until then, I'm Ryan Walter, and remember that solving your biggest business problems begins when you decide to accelerate your approach and achieve more.
At Parrels Advisory, our focus is your business's future. Having the right insight, experience, and perspective makes all the difference when tackling far-reaching issues within your company. We are here to simplify the steps, unlock your potential, and move you forward, making your vision a reality. We've helped startups achieve massive growth, mid-sized businesses navigate digital transformation, and enterprises embrace innovation. Wondering how to jumpstart your business and move it forward? Contact us to discuss your audacious goals during a complimentary consultation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Accelerate to Achieve. If you're enjoying the podcast, please subscribe and leave a review wherever you listen. Got a question, feedback on the program, or interested in being a guest? Simply go to parrels.co/A2A-podcast and send us a message. To learn more about our work or to book a consultation, visit us at parrels.co/contact. Until next time, remember that solving your biggest business problems begin when you decide to accelerate your approach and achieve more.